When your child suddenly becomes terrified at night, do you actually know what's happening inside their developing brain? Most people think they're just being dramatic. Maybe they're trying to avoid bedtime. Maybe they simply want one more hug, one more story, one more excuse to stay awake. But behind that frightened whisper of "don't leave," there's something much deeper that almost nobody tells parents. It's one of the most emotionally important developmental stages your child can experience. And if you misunderstand it, which almost every exhausted parent accidentally does, you might miss one of the biggest opportunities to teach their brain what safety truly feels like. Let's start with what nighttime fear really means. 1. The fear isn't the problem. It's proof their imagination has arrived. Has your child ever insisted there was a monster behind the curtain? You probably thought they were just making things up. But here's what's actually happening. For the first time, your child's brain can imagine things that aren't physically in front of them. That sounds small. It isn't. Developmental psychologists consider imagination one of the biggest cognitive leaps of early childhood. The same brain that can invent a monster under the bed is also becoming capable of imagining tomorrow, pretending, planning, empathy, dreams. The problem is that their emotional brain develops much faster than the logical part that checks whether those imagined dangers are real. So their body reacts as if the monster truly exists. Their heart races, their breathing changes, stress hormones increase. To them, the fear feels completely real. Think about that for a second. Your child isn't lying. Their brain is practicing one of humanity's greatest superpowers, imagination. It just hasn't learned how to control it yet. And by the way, if your child suddenly starts asking strange questions before bed like, "What happens if you disappear?" don't brush it off. We'll come back to why those questions matter near the end, and it may completely change how you respond. 2. Their brain is searching for a safety signal. Why does your child usually call for you instead of simply turning on a light? Most people assume they're just dependent. But here's what's actually happening inside their developing brain. A landmark study from Harvard University's Center on the Developing Child found that young children regulate stress through responsive relationships before they can regulate themselves. In other words, your calm nervous system becomes their temporary nervous system. Developmental neuroscientists call this co-regulation. It sounds scientific, but emotionally, it means something incredibly simple. When your child cries your name in the dark, they're borrowing your sense of safety because they haven't finished building their own. Researchers have repeatedly found that warm, predictable responses help strengthen neural circuits involved in emotional regulation. You aren't simply comforting them. You're helping wire the hardware they'll eventually use to calm themselves years later. Think about that. One reassuring voice today becomes tomorrow's inner voice. Here's what most exhausted parents don't realize. Your child isn't asking you to remove every fear. They're asking your brain to help organize theirs. 3. They don't need perfect parents. They need familiar ones. Have you noticed something strange? Your child may happily play with relatives all day, but the moment darkness comes, only you will do. You probably thought they were being clingy, but here's what's actually happening. Attachment theory tells us that children use their primary caregiver as a secure base. Not because they're weak, because that's exactly how human development is designed. Pediatric researchers have observed that during moments of uncertainty, children instinctively seek the person whose presence has consistently predicted safety. That isn't manipulation. It's biology. Your face, your smell, your voice, your footsteps in the hallway. All of those become neurological shortcuts telling the brain, "I'm safe now." Think about that for a second. You aren't just the person who tucks them into bed. You're becoming the blueprint their brain uses to define security itself. Years from now, when they face difficult moments, part of how they calm themselves may sound remarkably similar to how you comforted them tonight. That is the invisible power of attachment. And hey, if this is changing how you see the baby in your life, hit like and subscribe. It helps us reach more exhausted parents who need to know that what they are doing actually matters. 4. Nighttime fear is thousands of years older than your child. Here's where the science gets even more fascinating. Long before bedrooms, long before electricity, long before nightlights, darkness was dangerous. For most of human history, nighttime meant predators, isolation, Unknown sounds. Children who stayed close to trusted adults were simply more likely to survive. Evolution quietly rewarded that instinct. Even though your child's bedroom is perfectly safe, their ancient survival system doesn't know that. Their brain still treats darkness as a time to become more alert. This is why small sounds suddenly feel enormous at night. This is why familiar shadows suddenly look unfamiliar. Their survival brain always prefers a false alarm over missing a real danger. Evolution would rather scare your child unnecessarily than risk ignoring a predator. Think about that. Your child isn't overreacting. They're carrying survival software written tens of thousands of years before modern parenting ever existed. So, the next time they ask you to check the closet, remember, you're not arguing with logic. You're calming ancient biology. 5. Every safe bedtime is building tomorrow's emotional resilience. Here's what most parents never connect. Nighttime fears aren't only about tonight. They're quietly teaching your child's future brain how stress works. A landmark study published in Child Development found that consistent emotional support helps children gradually internalize healthy self-regulation. Translation? Every time your child experiences fear, and then experiences safety, their brain updates its prediction. I survived. I wasn't alone. I can recover. Those tiny experiences become emotional building blocks. Years later, that same child may face exams, friendship problems, heartbreak, failure. Their brain won't consciously remember tonight, but it will remember the emotional pattern: fear, support, recovery. That pattern becomes resilience. Think about that for a second. You aren't simply getting them back to sleep. You're rehearsing how they'll handle life's biggest challenges. 6. The question they aren't really asking. Remember earlier when I mentioned those strange bedtime questions? What if you disappear? What if something happens to you? This is exactly what I was talking about. Most parents hear those questions and immediately try to explain everything logically. But children often aren't asking for information. They're asking for reassurance, because underneath those questions sits a much deeper fear. If I'm vulnerable, will you still be here? This is what most parents never realize. Nighttime strips away distractions. No toys, no school, no cartoons, just thoughts. And for the first time, children begin noticing that the people they love exist separately from them. Psychologists call this an expanding awareness of relationships and permanence. Emotionally, it can feel overwhelming. Your child suddenly understands something incredible. You are not part of them, which means you could leave. That realization creates anxiety, but it also creates love, attachment, gratitude, connection, the very emotions that define healthy human relationships. So when they whisper, "Can you stay for one more minute?" they may actually be asking, "Will I still matter to you when I'm scared?" And every calm response quietly answers, yes. 7. When nighttime fear looks different. It's important to remember that every child develops differently. Some children hardly experience nighttime fears. Others go through intense phases. Neither automatically means something is wrong. However, if a child consistently shows almost no emotional response to separation, rarely seeks comfort from caregivers, or loses previously developed social and emotional skills, pediatricians may recommend a developmental evaluation. These signs do not automatically indicate autism or another developmental condition. Many factors can influence behavior, but early intervention changes everything. Trust your instincts. You know your child better than anyone. If something consistently feels unusual, not because another family said so, but because your child's development suddenly changes, it's always okay to ask questions. Seeking support isn't overreacting. It's advocating. And every child deserves that. So, when your child becomes scared at night, do you actually know what's happening inside their brain? Now you do. Their imagination is expanding. Their nervous system is learning regulation. Ancient survival instincts are activating, and every comforting interaction is helping build the emotional architecture they'll rely on for decades. That's not bedtime drama. That's not manipulation. That's your child learning how to be human. And every time you sit beside them, every time you speak calmly, every time you remind them they're safe, you're teaching a lesson their brain may carry for the rest of their life. That nighttime fear, it was never meaningless. And it shouldn't be to you either. You are doing a great job.